I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, I'm pleased to be speaking with Jennifer Cobbina. She's an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Her new book is called Hands Up, Don't Shoot: Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. It's a book that's really interesting to read and represents a broad spectrum of the communities of both Ferguson and Baltimore. It's also, of course, because of the content, really disturbing to hear the kinds of experiences that some have had, although not everybody has had the same kinds of experiences in these communities as she illustrates. It's a really powerful work that I recommend, especially if you have an interest in ethnography, interviewing, and issues relating to social justice and community policing. Of course, she also recommends 5 books on our site, tinap.org, so I encourage people to check that out and click on the new button, the Buy Me a Coffee button, if you're interested in showing some support for the podcast. It's always appreciated, in addition to going towards caffeine that goes towards web hosting and the purchasing of books and equipment, so always cool to show your support. Jennifer, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Perhaps we can start with your connection to Ferguson and how you got started interviewing people during those protests after Michael Brown's death and eventually coming to this book.
So it actually started when Michael Brown died. Like most people, I witnessed on television and social media the great demand for social justice from many of the community members. And what happened in Ferguson did feel pretty personal to me because I had lived in this city of St. Louis for 5 years while pursuing my doctorate degree at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And I had lived in a city that was only a couple of minutes away from Ferguson. And so when I was watching what was happening on television, it just felt really personal because I had lived in that area and called it home for about 5 years. And I had the opportunity to contribute to something when a colleague of mine, Victor Rios, he had emailed me along with social justice scholars who engaged in qualitative work and asked if we wanted to go down and essentially talk to protesters. And I jumped at the chance to do that. And we simply wanted to interview and document the experiences of Ferguson protesters after the killing of Michael Brown. And this group came to be known as the Ferguson Research Action Collaboration. And I chose, however, to extend my work by not only looking at protesters, but also looking at residents of the city, because I was well aware that people may choose not to protest, but yet still be affected by all of the issues that were taking place. And of course, as you know, in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, I not only looked at the city of Ferguson, but I also looked at the city of Baltimore. And so the reason I wrote the book, I realized that in the midst of me conducting these interviews, there was so much to tell, and there was no way I could write it in writing, a 20 or 30 page article. And the reality is they deserve to hear from the voices of those who were protesting.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful thing in that sense, because people who we might have seen on TV, we hear what they're thinking and what they have to say. What is the difference, or what are some of the main differences that you found when actually speaking to people on the streets versus what probably most people, regardless of the news station or the newspaper that they're reading, the story that they would be hearing compared to what you were hearing?
When I spoke to people on the streets who were actually protesting, I came to learn that the majority of activists were protesting for the first time. And the reason why they were protesting is because they had believed that Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were victims of injustice and that these deaths were not isolated events. And so they essentially many of them felt a moral and ethical responsibility to get involved and to affect change regarding putting an end to police violence and the criminalization of people of color. The reason why there were so many protesters is because there were I had asked about people's experiences with police prior to the Michael Brown and Freddie Gray incident. And the vast majority of activists had reported having negative encounters with the police, either directly or personally, or even indirectly. That is, if they hadn't had a negative encounter with the police, they had witnessed others, such as their family members, their friends, or their neighbors having negative encounters with the police, being the recipient of aggressive policing or disrespectful police behavior. And so in that sense, they were aware that they could be potentially a Michael Brown or Freddie Gray. And so they knew that these were not isolated events.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one of the things that clearly stood out was their experiences and how they differed in many ways from maybe people outside of those areas, or definitely the white versus the black experience of dealing with police.
Yeah.
What are the differences that you found that you mentioned in the book, just in case people haven't read the book yet? But also, what do those findings or what do those sentiments belie?
In terms of the findings, so one thing is that, as I mentioned, that the majority of residents and protesters had negative encounters with the police. However, there were racial distinctions. So in general, whites were often afforded respect and even given the benefit of the doubt by the police. They typically, when they reported having negative encounters with the police, it was typically during traffic-related stops because they were speeding or they were engaged in erratic driving, that type of thing. While on the other hand, blacks were often the recipients of over-policing and surveillance, and then the recipients of aggressive policing and racial profiling. And so that was something that was not really common amongst whites. If white individuals did talk about being the recipient of aggressive policing, it was because they also typically class played a role in that they resided in a poor, high crime neighborhood as well.
When talking to people about this and speaking to protesters, did you find that they were more vocal about, well, for example, the negative treatment that they had experienced than getting people who were not, like you said, active on the streets? Like during the protest, did you find that it was representative of the community, or was it representative of a certain group in the community?
The sample consisted of individuals who protested, but also residents. And my goal was to speak to Black and white residents and protesters, and the goal was simply to get people's experiences and even perceptions of the police. So I will say that while the majority of the people I spoke to had reported negative encounters with the police, and that is 2/3 of the people I spoke to had negative encounters with the police, 1/3 also did talk about having positive encounters with the police. And so I think that's important to note. I will say when a report was that encounters were positive with the police, this was typically when people were victims of usually property crimes such as theft or burglary. Then they would call the police, and they often noted the quick response time from police officers. And so as victims of a crime, they appreciated the quick response time of police officers, and some did express that the officers behaved appropriately. And then the other thing I will say that I noted with regard to when people said that they had positive encounters with the police, at least for African Americans, when they had positive encounters with the police, it was often because the encounter was void of physical or verbal assaults. So, people reported being stopped multiple times and being questioned about their whereabouts. But at the same time, because they weren't beaten or verbally disrespected, the encounter was said to be positive in nature. And while that was categorized as positive, the reality is there were many who talked about how stops, however, should never have happened in the first place, given that they were not engaging in any suspicious or unlawful behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really troubling history that you lay out, especially early on in the book, about the sort of, the history of policing in the U.S. to begin with was often associated with, slave owners, runaway slaves, and patrols looking to capture and survey these populations. And so it translates, there's obviously a deep and troubling history that can link modern day policing to those events.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's that was one of the goals of the book. And I think my book does shed light on the historical racial oppression and how that continues to play out in, again, modern day race relations and even police practices. many people are obviously aware that this nation, it was founded on a system of slavery. But what many people don't know is that the origins of policing in the United States can be traced to the institution of slavery. Slave patrols were among the first state-sponsored police forces, and they controlled the slave population. And then to defend their slave property interests, slave codes were established, which were essentially state laws that define the status of slaves and the rights of their owners. And the owners essentially were given absolute power to govern their slaves as chattel or as property. But even once slavery was abolished, there were states that relied on legal and prison systems in order to maintain racial subordination. For instance, black codes were established, and essentially black codes, they created new offenses for certain types of behaviors like loitering or vagrancy. And so anyone who was found in violation of these new laws essentially would be punishable by fines or imprisonment or even forced labor. Were certainly discriminatory because they were applied selectively to blacks in an attempt to restrict their freedom and force them to work based upon cheap labor. And even when black codes were overturned, states pursued racial segregation in an attempt to maintain racial subordination. And this is what led to the proliferation of Jim Crow, which refers to various state laws that essentially establish different rules for blacks and whites. And so it really regulated the nature of interracial social contact. And so what we're seeing is that from slave patrols and slave codes to black codes and Jim Crow laws, racially biased legislation was enforced for over 250 years. And the reason why that's important is because the effects are still lingering in the present day and age. And I think understanding the centrality of race in the formation and organization of policing is really necessary for us to get a clear picture of contemporary police practices towards racial minorities.
I mean, I want to back up a moment and think about the protests and the events that spurred on those protests in the current setting. Some people, definitely not everyone, but I think a number of people were voicing, I guess, ideas early on in terms of the technology of cell phones, saying this kind of mistreatment, this kind of brutality can't possibly keep going on because we now can video what these officers are doing. And so people on the streets should not, unarmed black men especially, should not be seen getting shot because there are cameras everywhere. And so the police won't do this anymore. Or at least that was, I think, the hope and inspiration for a lot of people thinking about the technologies. And we haven't seen that disappear. How come the technology didn't stop that, or at least hasn't had the effect that I think a number of people concerned with social justice were hoping?
I will say, I think social media has played a critical role in activism efforts. I mean, the reality is social media was used to tell the story of Michael Brown within hours. For example, the dissemination of a photo of Michael Brown's body lying on the street for 4 hours in the hot sun really became a global outrage within hours because of Twitter and because of Facebook. And without the use of social media, I think it would have likely remained a local controversy. But I guess in direct response to your question about why do we still see these incidents happening, I mean, this gets to a whole nother issue in general, just black people, especially young black men, being viewed with suspicion and being viewed as dangerous and criminals is a stereotype that has existed for quite some time. And so we still see the presence, of black people instilling fear in officers. And so ultimately, and unfortunately, what we see happening is when officers say that they feared for their lives and they shoot someone to death, in most cases, officers are not held criminally liable, and that's unfortunate because when any other civilian is to it actually takes the life of someone else, not only, especially if they are black individuals, we know from various studies that they're more likely to be prosecuted and convicted and sentenced pretty long periods of time, and so it's a pretty punitive response for the everyday civilian, particularly people of color. But yet we see when the police, who represent the state and they're supposed to protect and serve, individuals, we see that in many cases, they are not held criminally liable.
Yeah, actually, something that is just mind-boggling for me, and especially in reading this, is that in most of these cases where an officer shoots and kills someone, especially if they're unarmed, they do not face criminal charges, and they do not face, if they do face a trial, then they're not found guilty. But
right.
Oftentimes the city or the county or what have you is paying millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in civil suits to the families.
Yes.
How should we understand that? Because it seems like, okay, they're not guilty, fine, but then they are seen as sort of liable, even though they don't accept guilt for the issue. Families are still being paid, which seems to indicate criminality, if not malpractice or something. I know they wouldn't use those terms, but how do we negotiate that?
No, I think that's a good question, because we saw Michael Brown's family. They were awarded a $1.5 million wrongful death civil settlement lawsuit against the city. And Freddie Gray's family was awarded $6.4 million in a wrongful death civil settlement by the city. And, so what we're seeing is, while police shootings are generally found to be legally justified, the size of these civil awards suggests that the police have done something wrong, and so it's pretty hard to reconcile the fact that officers are not criminally liable, yet at the same time, the large amount of dollars that's being given to the families, again, suggests, like you said, malpractice, and unfortunately, officers don't have to pay, out of their pockets to these families, which is certainly, I think, problematic. But the other issue too is, we've seen from these two incidents, as well as other incidents of people dying at the hands of the police, that when it's not just the victim of police violence, right, who's suffering if they live, but it's the family members, particularly, when the family members, when they lose someone, they're suffering, but it's not even just the family members, but we see entire communities suffering and reeling as a result of what's happening. And I think that's important to consider as well, because trauma, can certainly take place when individuals are either victims of violence or have witnessed violence. And we see that with communities. And definitely, I would argue that community healing needs to also take place, because if it doesn't, it leads to community trauma.
Well, what's interesting, I guess, I think if I understood what you were pointing out in the book, it's the taxpayer money effectively that pays these families. And so taxpayers are paying and not arguably the people responsible for this. As you make clear, it's not just about one problematic officer or one problematic interaction. I mean, there's a systematic level, but then there's also obviously the individuals at play. A lot of the debates seem to either say, especially from the police forces, you hear about the rotten apple, the bad police officer who doesn't represent, and therefore it's not about policing, it's about this one bad person. I think a lot of other people, I think the worst kind of arguments against the police is that all police are corrupt, which then just pits people against the police. How do you negotiate, or how would you encourage people to think about, I guess, that spectrum going from like there's just one bad officer and everyone else is good to everyone is bad and don't trust the police at all? Is there a sort of medium ground that people can find, or how do we best address these kinds of debates? Yeah,
I think definitely the problem is if we just say one bad apple, right? What happens is, we replace that one bad apple, whether that person is fired or suspended, and we replace them with another officer. And certainly I will say there were many people who I spoke with who noted that not all police force and police are bad, right? They fully understood that. But at the same time, there's also an acknowledgement that there is a culture policing that essentially aggressively surveys and polices poor communities of color, right? And so what happens is in poor neighborhoods that have higher rates of unemployment and poverty and is dealing with pervasive inequality and structural discrimination, because of these issues, we know, not surprisingly, crime does take place in these neighborhoods. And so we see, but that also affects oftentimes the type and the quality of policing that's taking place in these neighborhoods. And essentially what often happens is entire neighborhoods can become criminalized and residents are viewed with suspicion because of where they live. And so the problem ends up being, I think, when we start looking at all residents within a neighborhood as criminal, and then they start being treated aggressively or being treated in a disrespectful manner. And that's certainly affecting the dignity of individuals, especially when they're engaged in lawful behavior. And I think that's problematic. And so that speaks to a culture of policing, I think, that needs to be addressed.
It makes sense in many ways to think about how the community is interacting with the police forces and with the officers involved and trying to ameliorate that situation. It's interesting that you mention in the book simply increasing people of color represented in the police force is not necessarily going to fix this issue. Body cams are not necessarily going to fix this issue, nor is sort of mandatory training on sensitivity to communities and dealing with diversity. First of all, I guess for anyone who's not particularly well versed in this stuff, why don't those things solve the problem? But also, what should we be considering when we're thinking about trying to make the situations better?
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the book, I talk about simply diversifying a police force in and of itself is not going to solve the problem of police violence. And the reason I came to that conclusion is because I had also thought that before doing the study, I also thought that was the answer, right? Let's just diversify. The police force should simply reflect the neighborhood in which it's to protect and serve, But when I did this study and I had asked people about their experiences with officers, I also asked them specifically about their experiences and their encounters with Black officers. And what I found is that 25% of the people I spoke with had negative encounters with Black officers. With many saying that Black officers can be just as aggressive, if not worse, than their white counterparts. And so I think there's a few things going on. I think, as I mentioned, when we're talking about in many of these neighborhoods, as I mentioned, there's, again, structural disadvantage, concentrated disadvantage within these neighborhoods. Again, high rates of unemployment and underemployment, poverty rates are high. And so in general, there are police who are located in these neighborhoods and aggressively policing residents within these neighborhoods. And Black and white police officers can start aggressively policing residents and treating all residents as if they're one in the same, engaging in unlawful behavior, which is problematic. And so that's why I argue, and I will say and I found this to be the case with Baltimoreans. Black Baltimoreans were more likely to come into contact with Black police officers because in Baltimore, nearly half of the police force is Black, whereas in Ferguson, at the time of the incident, over 90% of the police force was white. Mm-hmm. And so of those in Baltimore, of those who encountered Black officers, many were saying, not most, but many were saying that they've had experiences directly or indirectly where Black officers were just as aggressive. And so I argue that I think if we just think about diversifying a police force, I think that's a much simple solution to a much more complex and nuanced problem. And then, body cameras, I mentioned how body cameras, I think, to be honest, the verdict is still out on how effective body cameras are. I think there's been mixed results on how effective they are. And certainly we know that it can provide a sense of police accountability. I think my concern with body cameras or just even recording devices, we have seen, there are a couple of concerns I have. So we have seen on video a number of people's lives being taken at the hands of the police. And even though it's still recorded, as I mentioned, in most cases, officers are not held criminally liable, right? Even though we've all been privy to the video recording. But the issue is also to what is the cost in that? Because while we have all been privy to this, and while in most cases officers are not held criminally liable, the reality is there have been studies that show that particularly when African Americans or when Black people view other unarmed Black people dying at the hands of the police, it creates psychological distress. There is a trauma that happens when one continues to view other when Black people continue to view other unarmed Black individuals dying at the hands of the police. There is evidence that it suggests trauma takes place. And it doesn't happen when white people view this. It doesn't happen when Black people view even armed Black people dying at the hands of the police. But it's when Black people continuously view other unarmed Black people dying at the hands of the police, there is a community trauma that's taking place, a psychological distress. And so my fear is is that there is this unintended consequence that comes when we continue to view that. And to what cost? While we know it's creating mental distress, particularly among the Black community, is still not always resulting in officers being criminally liable. And so that is just my concern of a potential unintended consequence.
Yeah, I mean, and that speaks to a really big issue, I think, in all of this is the idea of empathy and the idea of placing yourself in a situation. Because, yes, if you're watching on TV and you see a person being shot unarmed, and that person could be related to you, or at least there's this feeling that, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood like that, or I look like that person, then there's this real sense of trauma. I think one of the most disturbing things I've seen is that there's also, as you mentioned, white people in general watching these videos will not feel the same sense of trauma, but also what I've seen is people basically rejecting this as, you know, not something to worry about, like clearly not showing any kind of trauma whatsoever. I think on one level, because they don't see themselves as potential victims of this kind of situation.
Yeah.
Is there any way to build empathy? I know this is a little bit outside the scope of your book, but have you seen ways in which getting a message across to people who otherwise might think, well, these are specific individuals, the police must know what they were doing, there must be more to it. And then the stuff like, you know, Michael Brown was a bad guy, these kinds of things that come out later to sort of justify what happens. Is there any way to, I guess, build empathy that you've seen?
That's a really good question, because that's what we typically see a lot, you know, not all, but with some white individuals, again, there's this lack of empathy. Well, that's their problem. It doesn't happen to us. If they would just be compliant, if they just acted this way, it wouldn't have happened, you know. So I think what I would say to that, because that's a very difficult question answer, and like, how do you respond to that? I think what I would say to that is, so there has been, like, you know, how do we try to deal with this issue? There have been in the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College. It has been attempting to explore ways to bring about reconciliation between the police and civilians. And specifically what they're doing is they're bringing officers together with members from the community to address past harms as well as present harms. They're providing opportunities for officers as well as members in the community to air grievances that they may have had with one another, and also address narratives that potentially keep both sides from moving towards the shared goal. And that shared goal is improving public safety, right? We all want to be safe, and but we also want to be, every single one of us, we all want to be treated with dignity and respect. And so this reconciliation process, it includes having very frank discussions about the traditions of policing and how traditional policing has been harmful and damaging to some members of the community. But it also allows the community residents to communicate some of the norms against violence and against crime. And though this type of conversation may be uncomfortable, it's necessary. And so this is an opportunity where you have law enforcement as well as members from the community talking about various ways that they may misunderstand each other, but also discussing ways in which they've contributed to harms that neither desires. And so I think having these conversations begin where there's dialogue being had about how to uncover common ground and can really help to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the community towards law enforcement. But I do think it is important for police to acknowledge the systematic racial harm that's experienced by Blacks. So even though obviously current police officers had no role in past injustices, you know, when I'm talking about issues of slavery and slave codes and Black codes, but it is important for police to acknowledge that the police badge, it does hold history, right? And one of racial oppression, that it just at least needs to be acknowledged. And so I think that's a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And that's the thing I wanted to ask about as well, is that you're providing a dialogue, first of all, by talking to people on the streets and representing their views in the book. But then the book itself provides the potential for further dialogue. Not everyone is necessarily, of course, going to read it or be interested in it. I think in terms of sociology and in terms of people interested in this kind of activism, of course, they're going to be interested in it, as they should be, as I would expect. but there's a whole group of people that would probably not be. In your opinion or in your experience, is there a goal or is there an ideal sort of community for this book and this kind of book that would, I don't know, would it grow into a conversation with those kind of people that I mean, I live in rural Georgia now. I see everywhere, beside Trump stickers, I see Blue Lives Matter stickers on bumpers and all this kind of stuff, which to me makes me think these are not people that are probably going to buy Hands Up, Don't Shoot.
Right.
Is
Right.
there a way to get the message though, or the ideas to those people, or is that sort of not what this scholarship is about?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I knew in writing this book that likely half of America is not going to read it, right? And if so, then half of America is going to be offended. But I knew I had to be true to the data and to what I was finding. And I do think at the very least, dialogue is important, right? Creating spaces, even though we may have very different views with one another, that's okay. But just creating spaces in which we can have dialogue with one another, where we're sharing our stories, our experiences, one's lived experiences, they're real. Right. Yeah. And I think the opportunity to share stories with one another, past experiences and the effect that had on one's individual, which understandably can color one's perception and can make one even more biased. But I think it is important to create spaces where people can share their experiences and the effect that some of these interactions with the police have had, and just having the opportunity to listen, not for the sake of arguing, but just I'm here to listen, right? And one person having the chance to share his or her story, then listening to another person who has very different views tell his or her story, because I think in doing that, it helps to humanize people. And I think that's what's often missing, right? Because you just mentioned about this empathy or the lack of empathy. Lack of empathy happens when we don't see each other as human beings, when we don't see each other as, we just can't relate to one another. And I think it is important to humanize one another. And I think one way to do that, and I think, as I mentioned too, this national network for safe communities at John Jay, I think is attempting to do that by creating these spaces for a group that's had a history of strained relationships come together and share their experiences and share their stories. I wholeheartedly believe that's important. I'm actually working with a local police department right now where we can try to do some of this itself, because I truly believe that this more of this needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely. It makes me think also, if you're doing these interviews and then you go to write this book, I imagine that, of course, you want to be true to what the people have told you, but you also have to be, I guess, well, to some extent objective, right? Like if they say something about their own personal experience and you happen to have, I don't know, numbers that contradict that in a larger sense, or it seems that, in some cases people were saying that they had seen things. And then I think it was, you asking them to say a little more detail. It turned out that they had heard that they hadn't necessarily seen it. And so, you want to be as open and caring, I imagine, for the people that you're speaking to as possible, but you also want to be a critical scholar. Yes. And you also want to be writing to a certain group of people who may have very different perspectives or opinions. How do you negotiate all this sort of people that you're interacting with as an author?
Yeah.
Do you have an ideal reader in mind, or do you try to make sure that certain groups are best represented in a certain way? How do you make a voice for yourself while trying to be as open and true to all of the different contingencies?
So to be honest, my number one goal as I was writing this book was to be true to the data. And I spent a long time trying to identify the common themes that were coming, that I was identifying from the data. Regardless of my thoughts or opinions, what are the common themes as I'm looking at people's actual experiences with the police versus their perceptions of the police, and regardless of what I think, I have to be true to the data. As a social scientist, as a critical scholar, I have to make sure that is being represented. But I will say, interestingly enough, my editor, I've always been trained, you got to be objective, just speak the findings. And my editor was encouraging me, as I was writing the book, sometimes telling me, Jennifer, you're writing too much like this is a journal article. We need to hear more of your voice. And that was actually a struggle because in general, when I'm writing journal articles, you try to leave your voice out of it, try to be as objective as possible. But I had to recognize too, I had to stop to think, well, wait, what is my voice? And recognize, any potential bias I might have. And then, writing up the data for what it's worth, but also weaving my voice in terms of how to tell these stories, but making sure that, for example, right, I told you that most people had negative encounters with the police, but in all fairness, some had positive encounters with the police, including Black individuals, some of who also noted having very negative encounters with the police. I think it's important to show some of these nuances, but it was something I struggled with. I will agree with you, Chris. It was something I did struggle with initially, in that my editor many times had to say, Jennifer, what's your voice? I need to hear more of your voice. Put it in there, weave it in there. And so that was something I had to learn as I wrote.
I mean, that's one of the things I struggle with myself in terms of scholarship and in terms of reading about, especially events like this, because I don't know, like, is it at all possible to even pretend to be objective when you hear about the deaths of Michael Brown being, 18-year-old being shot many times, Freddie Gray having his spine mostly severed from a police ride? Okay, so I and I imagine you and most people reading this would be very upset by those events. But also, if you hear the opposite, people are like, well, we have to defend the police. And then they get very upset about the representations of police. Is there an objective?
Yeah, and I was going to say, the reality is that, all of us, we're biased. If we're human, we're breathing, we're all biased. And I think just noting that, right? I learned when I was interviewing people, when people would say, like, I noted my bias. At one point, I was talking to one white individual who brought up, this was even, I think, after the interview. It's possible the recording was off, and she felt very comfortable with me. And then she brought up Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was killed by a police officer. And she started saying, she called him, the little, I don't curse, but the little S word. And she's like, I can't believe the little S word had the gun out. Didn't his parents ever teach him not to point a gun at a police officer? And like just cursing at him. And I remember just having this visceral reaction, like, oh my gosh, how could she say this? Here is a victim, a boy, and, who's dead. And there was so much I wanted to say, in terms of him being a young boy and, and children should be able to be children. And yet the officer made a quick judgment. But I also recognized that was my view, but also recognizing at that point in time, I was there as a social scientist, and I want to hear this view. I certainly don't want people to shut down because they don't want to be open with me. And so my goal at the time is not to change anyone's minds, but simply to capture this. But I struggled, right? But also noting this is where I stand on certain issues. But at the same time, when someone comes at me with a completely different issue, being there as a social scientist, being there as an interviewer, my goal is simply to capture that information and varying perspectives, some of which may be very different from my own perspective. And I think so it is important to note one's bias going in, and where one stands, and also being careful, at the example I gave, I don't think it was my responsibility sitting there as a interviewer to check that person, because I wanted to capture this type of information. And I certainly don't want people feeling uncomfortable sharing their perspective and shutting down because of fear what I might think.
Well, that brings up a couple issues about the way that you can represent these voices. So you start usually with a chapter or with a section with a quote from one of the interviewees, and then you explain the sort of variations that you found when talking to different people. And like you said, some people may have had very troublesome experiences, but not everybody. And some people had good things to say about their experiences with certain members of the police force. So do you have any advice for anyone else doing that kind of work where they've interviewed a number of subjects, they're trying to say what's happened, but obviously you have to put it into your own framework for your book or for your article, and you also have to, you basically have to cut, right? You have way too much information to show people everything, and so you want to be as objective as possible, but you also have to make some choices that are arguably subjective, right? You have to choose what's the quote that starts, if you're writing like this, what's the quote you start with? That's going to help frame what you're talking about. What are the quotes that you're going to use? And yeah, do you have any advice for people trying to take a large quantitative or qualitative sampling of different people's ideas and thoughts and, framing that on your own as an author?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to certainly figure out your research questions. Even before doing all of this, I had to outline the chapters. What are the chapters? What do I want my chapters to be? And then after doing that, what are my common themes? What are the common themes that are coming out based upon my research question? And then based upon these common, or I should say, these common themes, what are then the repeating ideas or these quotes that actually illustrate these themes? And then my voice comes in when I'm doing the interpretation. You're identifying the repeating ideas that keep coming up based upon the raw data. Mm-hmm. And then based upon that, these repeating ideas, you're identifying themes. And so when you come up with these themes, you're going to have the themes, you're going to have your quotes that actually demonstrate your themes, right? That's your proof. And then you're interpreting it for the reader. But then I think it's always important for me wholeheartedly as a qualitative scholar, it's always important to have a comparison group. And so in this case, I did several comparisons. So, there's comparing blacks and whites, comparing residents with protesters, comparing those who reside in the city of Ferguson with those who are in Baltimore. And I think that helps to increase the internal validity and reliability of the findings.
Yeah, maybe you could say a little bit more. I mean, maybe it just seems so obvious, but why is it important to have that at least a second group to which you can compare the first?
Yeah. And so I think, for example, had I just conducted the interviews in Ferguson, which that was initially the plan, just go to Ferguson. Yeah. Had I just conducted the interviews in Ferguson, I think I would have concluded we need to hire more Black officers. Because in Ferguson, again, as I mentioned, over 90% of the police force was white. And so very few actually had encounters with Black officers. So when people talked about Black officers, it was based upon their perceptions that I think we just need to diversify. I think that would help increase relationships between the police. But in Baltimore, the encounters were not just based upon perceptions, but actually direct encounters. And again, where 25% of the sample is stating I've actually had negative experiences with the police. I've been treated horribly by Black officers, and that's really not the solution. And so by having both groups, it allowed me to conclude, well, it's actually not the answer, because if I had just looked at Ferguson, it would have been a different story. And that's just and when I looked closely, I'm seeing that most people in Ferguson actually had perceptions of Black officers, but not direct encounters with Black officers.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting example of that. I mean, especially early on in the book, when you're sort of listing all of these events that happened primarily before these protests, but also that continue to happen after these protests, there is a sort of, going back to that idea of objectivity, there's a sort of visceral response, where, I don't know, for me, it varies between anger and just disillusion with the society or the system. And I'm wondering, though, I mean, you have to have an emotional response yourself. Is there a way in which you, I don't know, keep yourself in check, or do you feel angry listening to some of these horrible stories? And do you want any of that to come across in the writing, or do you want to keep that away from your writing? First of all, how do you feel? And then how do you work with those emotions?
So when I was doing these interviews, and when you hear time and time again that people are having such horrible experiences with the police, and some of what I was hearing is reminiscent of the 1950s and 60s, right? Mm-hmm. I felt that same anger. I felt that same frustration. I felt that same outrage as people are talking to me. And in many of the interviews, this was when I conducted the interviews, it was 2 to 3 months after the death of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. It was during the height of protests, and racial tensions were high. There were many female interviewees who would break down and start crying as I'm asking them about experiences, how how they even teach their kids when it comes to encountering police officers. And as I'm asking them about the future, because it was unclear what would happen. People didn't know if they should stay in Ferguson, should they move, what does this mean if, the first set of interviews I did was before the decision was made not to indict Darren Wilson. And I went back a month after the decision was made not to indict him. And so in the first round of interviews, there was a lot of fear that if he's not indicted, there's going to be riots. The city is going to be chaotic. And there was a lot of fear. And so I had many people breaking down. And so I'm feeling the sadness and the hopelessness that they're feeling, the frustration, the outrage, and the anger. And yes, so as I'm writing, the goal is I was trying to be objective with what I'm writing, but at the same time, through people's quotes, I'm hoping that they feel much of the feelings that my participants were having, right? And hoping that they're somehow able to relate to some of these experiences, right? Because as I mentioned, many activists, it was the cumulative impact of these negative police encounters by Ferguson and Baltimore residents that really set the stage for reactions to the killings of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. That is, people saw themselves as potentially being a victim themselves, or being a Michael Brown, being a Freddie Gray, or their family members could easily be the victim of a tragic shooting. And so there were people who felt essentially a moral and ethical responsibility to get involved. For example, one of the participants, Marie, she's a Latina protester, and she said, "It's my human duty to protest, and to not answer that call is a disgrace to my humanity. You see a child drowning in a river and you don't jump in to save them. Are you complicit in that?" I say yes. And I say that there are thousands of people, young people, primarily Black and brown, dying in the river. And to not act, to not critique off of Facebook, to pretend that it doesn't impact me is a slight on my humanity. Right. So here we see in Maria's quote this drive. And this was not just with Maria. There are so many who felt a moral duty to do something, because to not is going to result in further killings of Black and brown people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a really powerful quote you just read. Is there a better way to show those kinds of emotions, or do you try to primarily let the quotes or the interviewees speak for themselves when you're collecting and showing this? Like when you're like, for example, in the chapter, when you're summarizing some of the reasons why protesters came out there, I noticed that, well, there's a few different ways in which you do it, but how do you consciously try to think like, look, this is the emotions that I'm seeing, and this is how I'm going to make sure that the reader understands that? Do you think about it in that way, and do you try to primarily focus on what they've, like, using the words that they've said, or do you try to add some of that into your analysis of the overall sentiments? Like, how do you best show that to the reader?
So I definitely try to, after presenting various quotes and in the analysis, in the interpretation, I'm trying to summarize people's thoughts and feelings that they're having to pretty much get the reader to feel what's going on and understand the actions that follow. So I try to do it through the quotes, but also through my own interpretation of the actual quotes that people have provided to me through the interviews.
Mm-hmm. And on the flip side of that, in the conclusion, you mention a journalist who talks about the sort of exhaustion that can come from doing this work and being involved in multiple days and weeks and even perhaps months in some cases of different protests and different movements. There's just an increasingly numb to the spectacle of Black death is the quote that you use here. The harsh emotions that you experience through seeing these things, through traumatically possibly reliving that through video clips that you continue to see in the media, and then again from talking to people. It's very high emotions. Is it almost inevitable that you sort of burn out or that you become exhausted from that? And if not, are there ways to sort of protect viewers and also researchers? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I will say that it's common, for instance, for activists to sometimes burn out. And they're in the attempt to try to bring about change. We know that change is slow, and it can take years to bring about change. And among activists, it's not uncommon to see anxiety and depression amongst people who are protesting. And if things are not moving fast enough, or when you're essentially you're fighting against a system, right, that's resistant to change. And so and in many cases, activists sometimes they have to step back and engage in self-care and just take a break, only to come back in again, because it's exhausting. It can be mentally and emotionally exhausting, trying to bring about change, trying to convince so many people of what's happening, and yet some people don't seem to get it. It can be incredibly challenging, because on the one hand, you have people who are trying to bring about change, and some people don't get it. While on the other hand, some people don't care or are just numb to all of what's going on. In the book, I do mention again about the importance of just being careful that we are not using these Black deaths as spectacles, because that certainly is problematic, in that we see much of sometimes the media will use these deaths as a way to, people watch it, and it's a way to kind of generate more viewers. But again, I believe that there are a lot of consequences to that. As I mentioned, the unintended consequence of additional trauma, particularly for much of the Black community who continues to view Black people dying at the hands of the police.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's tempting to, as a media consumer, to either become numb to it or to ignore these kinds of images, because especially I think during the height of these protests, you would see images and you would have lists of all of these horrible events. And so, yeah, I think it's even just as a viewer, you can become less sentimental than you would be the first, second, third time you see these images. Is that something, though, that researchers, I think, should watch out for, like themselves becoming a little bit numb to this data and to these numbers of really horrible events? But I mean, when you're looking at it systematically and when you're researching with hundreds of people, you yourself must have heard really, really challenging experiences. But maybe by the 50th time, you're just you're used to hearing that. That's the same story you've heard 49 other times. Is there a way that you can combat, I guess, exhaustion or burnout or fatigue as an interviewer or as a researcher?
So for me, I had to talk this out with other people, talk to other people, because, it's like I had people talking to me about all of these issues. And sometimes I needed to just either talk to other people about what I'm hearing, and even just finding different ways to decompress. Right. So that you're not carrying everything, but yet at the same time, making sure, and, I'm writing memos. Like I would write memos about each interview and what was being stated, the salient things that stood out and what I was hearing. And also noting, my reactions and my feelings to this as well. So I would talk it out, and I would also write things down as a way to process some of this information, because at least I'm getting it out.
Well, that makes sense. I'm wondering if you've considered this with students, with either, maybe graduate researchers, but also with, if you're teaching a class with undergraduates and you want to talk about these issues and you want to expose them either, in some cases, perhaps for the first time, but I think a lot of cases to really dive into the critical issues involving things like the Ferguson protests and the events that led up to that. Is there a concern that, like, maybe I'm showing too much graphic violence, or maybe I'm talking too much about a really traumatic event, or, maybe on another level that's necessary to really get through to people? What do you think about when dealing with students?
When I do train my students, when we're working on various projects, we tell them, especially when we're dealing with sensitive issues, that you're likely going to have some emotions well up in you. So it is important that, we create a space where they can come to us as a research team to talk to some of us, or to just be ready to talk to somebody about some of what you're experiencing and write things down and just figure out ways to decompress, however you know how. But I do think it's important. because I definitely hear what you're saying about when talking about people's experiences, how much to really say. I think it's important as a social scientist to share that, like, it's our job to write about these issues, no matter how tough and difficult, because people need to see it. People need to understand it. I think we do a disservice if we sugarcoat it, but I think self-care is important. So talking it out with someone, a trusted person, whoever it is, I think is important, as well as just journaling, writing things down. So that way you're not like, I had to make sure that I'm not carrying the weight of everyone's stories on my shoulders. Because the way I'm going to choose to amplify these voices is through writing, writing essentially what came to be this book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. But self-care is important.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's helpful. Yeah. To be self-reflective, like you said, by getting it down either on paper, to speaking to people. The work you're doing is important and the ideas that you're covering are important. But I think you could go over the top if you wanted to, not that you did at all, but showing like what others would say, gratuitous violence, or like, for example, you talk
Okay.
about how the body was there and people were very upset and people had been taking pictures with their cell phone to show and post on social media saying like, this event is happening in Ferguson. You could easily post all of those pictures in the book and get people potentially sort of really concerned about that, but also, show a lot of the violence that you're speaking about. Well, how do you weigh those pros and cons though? Because I don't think any of us as researchers or social scientists want to sensationalize it.
Right.
But it's also very visceral and very traumatic even just speaking about it. So like, how do you weigh that other side where maybe you're going too far, or you could go too far?
So, yeah, I guess for me, like, I never even thought to show any of the pictures in the book. I think the reality is we know people can access that if they want to. And that wasn't my goal. The goal of the book is really to talk about people's experiences and perceptions of the police, as well as to understand what galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement. And then trying to also understand how, police officers' response during these protests were pretty militarized. And so looking at how did that affect protesters' willingness to engage in future street protests? So that was the goal of the book. And I think for me, it's always keeping the goals of the book in mind. I'm not, and certainly not taking advantage of trying to sensationalize, Michael Brown's death, Freddie Gray's death, but bringing attention to because, the reality is, and I say it in my book, that these protests were about more than Michael Brown and more than Freddie Gray. It's really highlighting how people are being policed in very different ways based upon, their race and their gender, and class is coming into play. And so that's what I was trying to highlight. And I'm not a journalist, so my goal is not to sensationalize certain incidents. And my goal as a scholar, I believe I'm a critical scholar, and I have to be wise in my approach, but also be respectful as well.
Yeah, I think that's pretty sound advice. If you go on to your next book project or your next research project, what are you going to take away from your experience with Hands Up, Don't Shoot, with the work you did on that? What are you going to maybe do differently? What are you going to continue doing based on that experience?
That's a good question. I mean, I will say, like, if I can go back again, because in terms of this book, I ended up conducting initial and follow-up interviews in Ferguson, but in Baltimore, I had only conducted initial interviews. I wasn't able to conduct follow-up interviews, and I wish I could have gone back and done follow-up interviews. So yeah, well, I will say, if I were to do this again, I would certainly have done follow-up interviews. If I could do this again, also, one thing we didn't talk about is towards the end of the book, I categorized protesters. And for instance, people who protested on the front lines, usually they were protesting every single day, every other day. Many of them were sleeping in tents outside. And essentially, some of them quit their jobs and quit going to school because they believed that their whole purpose in life was to essentially protest in order to bring attention to these issues of race and racism and policing and bring about change. And so these were what I call the revolutionary protesters. So on the one hand, there were revolutionary protesters protesting every single day and trying to bring about change. But there was also another group, what I call the tourist protesters, in that they protested less than 3 times, but they really, for the most part, they weren't necessarily committed to the protest movement, but they were much more interested in, they were well aware that history was in being made, and they were more curious than anything. And so if I could do this again, to be honest, what I noticed is that in Ferguson, I had a lot more revolutionary protesters, people protesting on the front lines. And I found out that one of my flyers was being distributed during a protest. And so, it was easy. My phone was blowing up. It was easy for me to get participants in Ferguson. It was a little bit more challenging in Baltimore, and I had much fewer of the revolutionary protesters in Baltimore than in Ferguson. And so if I could have done this again, I would try to make I don't know how, but I think because this was I had a lot of networks in St. Louis, but I wish I had a little bit more networks in Baltimore where I could have actually talked to more people who were on the front lines protesting. But if I were to do, in terms of moving forward, if I were to do something like this again, I think it would be a matter of getting more help early on, getting more students. So when I first did these interviews, I went the first time by myself for 1 week. I conducted interviews by myself literally for a week, and probably interviewed about 50 people. And even after interviewing 50 people, I realized I need to come back because I knew I hadn't hit saturation yet. I was still learning so much from the protests, from the participants. And so I went back a couple of weeks later with a grad student to help me as well. And so I think early on, I would have taken 1 or 2 students to assist with data collection.
I guess, in retrospect, there's always things we could do differently. Are you going to continue thinking about the same topics from this book, or have you changed your focus at all in the work that you're doing now or that you're planning to do?
I mean, I will say issues of race has always been a salient role in much of the work that I do. I think moving forward, I am really focused on trying to see what I can do, as I mentioned, like working with the police department and trying to bridge much of this with the police and communities of color, and trying to create spaces in which we can, particularly when there's a grievance or an incident that happened that may have gone wrong, and trying to bring officers and the specific civilian together in these spaces where we're just talking about what happened and the effect it had on them. And so that's something I'm thinking about moving forward. One thing I also want to say, though, that I didn't get a chance to, you never asked, or you may have asked, but I didn't answer the question because a few other questions were asked. And that is, so what do I conclude? Like, what needs to happen? And so in the conclusion section of my book, I do make the case that, in the past 40 years, we've seen the U.S. has doubled down on investments in the police, and yet we still had the Michael Brown incident, the Freddie Gray incident, and we've seen numerous other Black civilians dying at the hands of the police. And we also saw the massive protests that took place across the nation in the aftermath of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. And so what I argue in the book is that we can use the protests in Ferguson and Baltimore to learn about what we're doing wrong and where we can allocate these resources. And I do believe wholeheartedly that rather than putting dollars into the police and into prisons, which we've been doing for the past 40 years, investments need to be made in marginalized individuals and communities. So as I've already mentioned, is that, we know that structural disadvantage and pervasive inequality, joblessness, and inadequate public services, these are all common characteristics of poor neighborhoods. And so not surprisingly, crime is common in these neighborhoods. And so I believe funds should be used on prevention and intervention initiatives, particularly for at-risk youth and young adults who have promise. Dollars also need to be spent on addressing mental health and substance abuse and homelessness, because currently the way we treat individuals dealing with these issues is we typically demonize and criminalize And then also, I think resources should be used to bring much more jobs into poor communities in which and where they're being offered living wages and provided with quality education. And I think ending the killing of Black people is going to require doubling down on investments in the community, where we're making efforts to strengthen and stabilize the community, as opposed to continuously doubling down on investments in the police or the criminal justice system.
It's so one of the most frustrating things for me in these kinds of topics is that it seems most people in criminology and sociology would definitely agree with that, and to even conclude that only policing and prisons, funding those, will not actually help any of the problems that they're supposed to help. But it's also so frustrating to see that political promises of law and order, which is only going to fund the police. And everyone who studies it knows that that's actually going to create, in many ways, more crime and would be less cost effective than if you were to invest in communities. But I think that's part of why books like these are so important and draw attention to these issues. And I hope that more and more people will listen, as I think that they're doing. So Jennifer, I've taken up a lot of your time. I really appreciate you talking to me about Hands Up, Don't Shoot. I think it's crucial work, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Once again, thank you very much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. It's my pleasure to do these interviews, and it's been really rewarding speaking to so many people and hearing from so many listeners in the last year or two, especially. As always, check out tinap.org to see what Jennifer and others recommend. They have a list of 5 books and their thoughts on them, and there's ways to contact me if you have books or ideas for the next interviews that might happen in season 3 or 4, or hopefully many more to come. In the meantime, if you're an academic or scholar, I hope your work is going well. I hope these interviews might provide some help or inspiration. I know they do for me, and I'll keep doing it. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.